The wind moved softly across the red earth of the Transkei. It carried with it the whispers of an ancient land, a land of cattle bells and quiet pride, of rivers that remembered the steps of kings and the songs of warriors long gone. In the small village of Mvezo, 1918, a child was born who would one day bear the weight of a nation's sorrow and its redemption. His name was Rolihlahla, the troublemaker. The world would come to know him as Nelson Mandela. He was born not into wealth or privilege, but into a lineage of dignity. His father was a counselor to the Thembu king, a man of principles who defied injustice until it cost him his position. His mother, deeply spiritual, taught him that the measure of a man is not his birth but his heart. In their thatched home, young Mandela absorbed lessons that would shape the foundation of his life: the power of respect, the meaning of community, and the quiet strength of endurance. But outside those hills, another story was being written, a darker one. South Africa, under white rule, had already begun constructing the walls of separation. Skin had become a sentence. Color determined destiny. Black South Africans were denied land, denied voice, denied the simple right to be seen as human. The seeds of apartheid were already in the soil, and they would soon grow into thorns that cut through generations. Mandela's childhood was simple, almost idyllic. He herded sheep, listened to elders speak of bravery and honor by the firelight, and dreamed of becoming a counselor like his father. Yet the flame of injustice flickered even then. Stories of people displaced, humiliated, stripped of everything but their will to survive. To a young boy it was confusing. To the man he would become it was a calling. When his father died, Mandela was taken under the guardianship of Chief Yongin Taba Dalindyebo, who would later send him to missionary school. There he first encountered the paradox of colonial education, a system that preached morality while practicing subjugation. The Bible spoke of equality. The law outside the classroom did not. Still, Mandela absorbed knowledge like dry earth drinking rain. He read the great speeches, admired heroes of freedom, and began to believe that education could be a weapon sharper than any sword. In the corridors of Fort Hare University, he found his voice, bold, questioning, unafraid. It was there that he first tasted rebellion, when he joined a student protest against the administration's unfair rules. Expelled but unbroken, he left Fort Hare with more than knowledge. He carried the first ember of defiance. Johannesburg awaited him, a city of gold and shadows. He worked as a clerk, lived in small rooms, and studied law at night. The city exposed him to the cruelty of a system designed to break the human spirit: past laws, police brutality, constant humiliation. But it also revealed something else: the resilience of those who refused to bow. It was in those streets that Mandela met men and women who believed that freedom was not a dream, but a right worth fighting for. He joined the African National Congress, not yet as a leader, but as a listener, a learner. Every speech he heard, every protest he witnessed carved purpose into his heart. And yet destiny always comes wrapped in fire. The South Africa of Mandela's youth was nearing a boiling point. In 1948, apartheid became law, a nightmare codified in ink and enforced with bullets. Somewhere in the crowded heart of Johannesburg, a young lawyer looked out of a small window at the city that caged his people. He clenched his fist, not in hatred but in promise. "There is no easy walk to freedom," he would one day say, "but walk we must." And thus began the journey of a man who would be called a terrorist, then a martyr, then a savior. A man who would walk from the red dust of Mvezo to the iron gates of Robben Island and beyond. The boy named Troublemaker had found his trouble, and the world would never be the same. By the dawn of the 1950s, the lines of oppression in South Africa were drawn deep into the ground: black from white, freedom from privilege, justice from power. The apartheid regime ruled with laws as sharp as knives, slicing every trace of equality into silence. But beneath those laws, something older and stronger began to stir, a rising heartbeat that would not yield. And among those who heard it most clearly was Nelson Mandela. Johannesburg had become his battlefield. By day he was a young lawyer defending the defenseless, men and women accused of trespassing, for walking into white areas, families stripped of their homes because their skin was the wrong shade. By night he met with members of the African National Congress, speaking in whispers, planning in hope. The law was supposed to be his weapon, but he was beginning to realize that laws, when written by oppressors, were nothing more than chains in disguise. Still, Mandela believed in peaceful resistance. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 became his proving ground. Together with his comrades, he organized acts of civil disobedience, black South Africans entering white-only stations, breaking unjust curfews, and refusing to carry the hated passbooks. They filled the jails willingly, their dignity intact even behind bars. For the first time, the world began to take notice. Mandela, tall, eloquent, and unflinching, emerged as one of the campaign's most powerful voices. But with each act of courage came retaliation. The government struck back harder. New laws, new arrests, new cruelty. Mandela and his allies were watched, followed, interrogated. He was banned from speaking publicly, confined to Johannesburg, his every word deemed a threat. Yet the silence only made him stronger. The more they tried to erase his voice, the more it echoed through others. It was during this time that Mandela's life became a battlefield of another kind, between duty and love. His wife, Evelyn, struggled to understand the man who seemed married to the movement as much as to her. Their home, once a refuge, became a place of arguments and absences. The price of purpose, Mandela learned, was often paid in loneliness. Still, the struggle pressed on. In 1955, a gathering of thousands convened at Kliptown to draft the Freedom Charter, a vision of a new South Africa where all shall be equal before the law. Mandela was there, standing in the open field as the words were read aloud. For a brief moment, it felt as if the sun itself stood still, the birth of a dream powerful enough to terrify an empire. That dream, however, would soon lead him into darkness. In 1960, police opened fire on peaceful demonstrators in Sharperville, killing 69 unarmed men and women. The massacre tore through the nation's soul and through Mandela's faith in peaceful protest. He had believed change could come through patience and dialogue. Now he saw that the regime's only language was force. The decision that followed would forever divide history and define him. With heavy heart and burning resolve, Mandela helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, the armed wing of the ANC. It was not an army of conquest, but of resistance. They would sabotage power stations, disrupt communication lines, and strike not at lives but at symbols of tyranny. To the government, he became a terrorist. To his people, he became a guardian of their last hope. He lived in the shadows now, moving between safe houses, disguising himself as a laborer, a driver, even a gardener. The press called him the Black Pimpernel. For 18 months he lived like a ghost among his own countrymen, hunted but unbroken. Each day brought new danger. Each night, he wondered whether his next sunrise would come behind bars. In 1962, that sunrise ended. A police roadblock stopped his car on a lonely road outside Howick. He was arrested, betrayed by an informer, captured by the same system he had fought to expose. When they brought him to trial, he stood tall, defiant, his voice echoing across the courtroom. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society," he declared, eyes unflinching before his judges. "It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The sentence that followed was not death, not yet, but imprisonment. The world outside would move on. The man inside would wait. Nelson Mandela was 39 years old. His fight for freedom had just entered its darkest chapter. He would trade the streets of Johannesburg for the stone walls of Robben Island. He would exchange his suit for a number, 466664. The lawyer had become the prisoner. And yet, behind those bars, a new kind of freedom was waiting to be born. The gates of Robben Island clanged shut with a sound that seemed to swallow the world. Beyond those iron bars stretched a horizon of stone and sea, bleak, unending, merciless. Here the wind smelled of salt and despair, and the cries of the gulls mingled with the clang of chains. Nelson Mandela, now prisoner 46664, was led into his new existence, a place designed not just to confine men, but to break them. Each morning began before dawn. Prisoners were woken by shouted orders, marched into the limestone quarry and handed crude tools. The work was endless, crushing rock under the searing sun until the white dust burned their eyes and skin. Speaking was forbidden, water was rationed, letters were censored, and visits came only once every 6 months. The island was a factory of silence. But within that silence, Mandela began to listen, not to his captors but to himself. In the endless rhythm of hammer and stone, he found something unbreakable. The walls could imprison his body, but not his dignity. In every lash, in every insult, in every attempt to erase his humanity, he discovered a deeper kind of strength. The fight for freedom, he realized, was not only against a system, it was against the hatred it tried to plant within him. He refused to let bitterness rule his heart. "If I hated them," he once wrote, "I would be giving them victory." And so he turned his prison cell into a classroom. Using smuggled newspapers and coded notes, he taught his fellow inmates about law, history, and leadership. They called Robben Island the University of the Struggle. Young men who entered with anger left with purpose. Mandela became their quiet professor, shaping minds that would one day rebuild a nation. The guards, too, began to change. At first, they treated him like a number. But over the years, even they began to see in him something extraordinary, a calm that could not be broken. Some guards sought his advice in secret. Others began to address him as Mr. Mandela. Respect, like freedom, could not be legislated. It had to be earned. Beyond the island, the world moved on. Decades passed. New wars began and ended. South Africa remained a fortress of apartheid. Yet whispers of Mandela's name grew louder, first across townships, then across oceans. His face, unseen for years, became a symbol printed on posters, painted on walls, sung in freedom songs that echoed through the streets of Soweto. But inside his cell, time seemed frozen. Birthdays faded into one another. His children grew up without him. His mother died. So did his eldest son. The pain was invisible but endless, the cost of a dream that seemed to slip further away with each sunrise. Still, he endured. He gardened in the prison courtyard, tending to fragile plants that somehow bloomed between stones. Those flowers became symbols of his inner defiance, quiet, patient, unstoppable. Even as the regime tried to bury him, he continued to grow. By the 1980s, the winds of history began to shift. South Africa was trembling under its own contradictions. Economy collapsing, protests raging, the world demanding change. The government, desperate to save face, reached out to Mandela in secret. They offered him freedom, but at a price. He refused. Freedom, he said, was meaningless if his people remained in chains. He would not leave the island while others still suffered behind bars. 27 years. That was how long he spent in prison, more than half his adult life, and yet those years transformed him. The young lawyer who once believed in righteous anger emerged as something greater, a man who understood that real victory was not in defeating one's enemies, but in forgiving them. When the gates finally opened in 1990, the world watched in silence. Cameras flashed, crowds wept, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. Mandela stepped into the sunlight. His hair grayed, his body aged, but his spirit unbowed. He raised his fist not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of the journey still ahead. The man who had entered prison as a revolutionary walked out as something far more powerful, a peacemaker. Yet peace, he knew, was the hardest war of all. As he drove through cheering streets, past faces painted with tears and joy, he whispered a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. We are not free until all are free. That day, Nelson Mandela was no longer just a man. He was the living embodiment of hope itself. But hope, like freedom, must be tested. And the greatest test of his life was yet to come. When Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, the world erupted. Crowds poured into the streets. Songs of liberation echoed from township to township, and the air vibrated with something South Africa had almost forgotten: hope. But freedom, Mandela knew, was not an ending. It was a beginning, and beginnings are never gentle. The years that followed his release were among the most dangerous of all. Apartheid was dying, but it would not die quietly. Townships burned, rival factions clashed, and the country teetered on the edge of civil war. The dream of equality could still be crushed beneath the weight of revenge. Mandela became the bridge between two worlds, the old and the new, the oppressed and the oppressor. He met with the same men who had once ordered his imprisonment, looked them in the eyes and offered something that seemed impossible: dialogue. His former jailers expected fury. Instead, they found grace. He told them, "You took away my freedom for 27 years. You cannot take my forgiveness." To many of his followers, this sounded like surrender. But Mandela saw further than vengeance. He understood that South Africa's greatest victory would not be the fall of apartheid. It would be learning to live together after it. The negotiations were brutal. Every meeting was a battlefield of words and tempers. He faced politicians who still saw him as a threat, soldiers who still saw him as an enemy, and radicals who demanded that he burn the system to the ground. He did not waver. Peace, he said, is not the absence of conflict, but the creation of understanding. And so, in 1994, against every prediction, South Africa held its first democratic election. Lines stretched for miles. Old men and women who had never before voted stood beneath the sun for hours, tears streaming down faces that had seen a lifetime of injustice. When the results came, they changed history forever. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black president of South Africa. But that title to him was not a throne. It was a cross to carry. The nation he inherited was broken. Its people were divided by fear, poverty, and resentment. Its institutions were riddled with the ghosts of apartheid. To rule such a country with vengeance would have been easy. To rule it with mercy, that was the impossible task. Mandela chose mercy. He reached out not just to the victims of apartheid, but to its architects. He invited his former jailers to his inauguration. He kept many white civil servants in his government. He wore the jersey of the national rugby team, once a hated symbol of white pride, and stood before a divided crowd, asking them to cheer together. That moment, one man standing in a stadium filled with both hope and hatred, became the image of a new South Africa. Through the years, he faced betrayals, political failures, and the weight of expectations no man could bear. He watched his friends grow impatient, his enemies plot, his nation stumble. But still he smiled. That calm, wise smile that hid oceans of pain. He spent nights alone, writing letters he would never send, reflecting on the irony of his life. The man once condemned for treason was now the guardian of the very country that condemned him. The prisoner had become the protector. The price of that transformation was immense. His marriage to Winnie Mandela collapsed under the strain of separation and politics. His health began to fail, and yet he carried on, determined to finish his long walk with dignity. He served only one term as president. Power, he believed, was not something to possess, but something to pass on. In 1999, he stepped down voluntarily, a gesture that stunned the world. In a continent often scarred by lifelong rulers, Mandela reminded everyone that leadership meant service, not supremacy. He spent his later years speaking for peace, education, and reconciliation. He became a global symbol of endurance, a man who had walked through hell and emerged with an open hand instead of a clenched fist. And yet, even in his greatness, Mandela never saw himself as a saint. "I am not a saint," he once said, "unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." He had seen the best and worst of humanity, in his captors, in his comrades, and even in himself. He knew that the world's greatest struggle was not between races or nations, but between forgiveness and fear. As he grew older, he began to withdraw from public life. His speeches grew quieter, his movements slower. He spent his days at his home in Kunu, tending to the earth like he once tended to his prison garden. The same hands that had once clenched iron bars now planted seeds in the soil of his ancestors. In those final years, visitors often found him sitting by the window at sunset, the light catching the deep lines on his face, each one a scar, a memory, a story of resistance and grace. He had lived long enough to see his dream take root. South Africa was far from perfect, but it was free. When Nelson Mandela finally passed away on December 5, 2013, the world did not mourn him as it mourns a fallen leader. It mourned him as one mourns a father. Cities dimmed their lights. People sang in the streets. Across the globe, millions whispered the same word, Madiba. He had not just changed a country. He had changed what the world believed possible. The world without Nelson Mandela felt strangely quieter. No more of his gentle voice, no more of that calm gaze that could disarm even the angriest man. But his absence did not feel like an ending. It felt like a reflection. In South Africa, murals of his face appeared on walls and buildings. Children born long after his imprisonment still called him Tata, father. His image was not one of a politician, but of a man who had shown humanity what true strength looked like, because Mandela's greatest legacy was not political freedom. It was emotional freedom, the liberation of the heart from hatred. He had proven that forgiveness was not weakness. It was the highest form of courage. He once said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." That lesson was the essence of his life. He did not conquer through violence, but through empathy. He did not destroy his enemies. He transformed them, and in doing so, he transformed the world's idea of what leadership could be. Mandela's story is often told as a triumph of perseverance, and it is. But beneath that triumph lies a deeper truth. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a daily choice. He had to choose it every morning in prison, and every morning as president. That is why his life resonates far beyond politics, because it speaks to the private wars inside every human being. The war between anger and understanding, between resentment and mercy, between what we deserve and what we are capable of giving. Mandela showed that even the most wounded soul can choose compassion. He proved that love, when rooted in principle, is stronger than any weapon or wall. When he was buried in Kunu, the village of his childhood, the sky was heavy with rain, a rare blessing in his homeland. Thousands gathered in silence as his coffin was lowered into the earth. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, just a hush, as if the world itself bowed in gratitude. In that stillness, one could almost imagine his voice again, calm, wise, and unbroken. The true test of freedom is not how we treat our friends, but how we treat our enemies. And perhaps that is the moral of his story, that peace is not born from power, but from the refusal to let hatred define you. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. That one man's grace can become a nation's rebirth. Nelson Mandela's journey reminds us that the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be imprisoned. It may be beaten, silenced, or betrayed, but it will rise again and again until it finds light. His life ended as all great lives do, not with finality, but with continuity. The seeds he planted grew into movements, laws, and hearts around the world. His name became more than a man. It became a verb, a prayer, a possibility. In every act of reconciliation, in every moment of restraint, in every person who chooses understanding over vengeance, he lives. Because Mandela's true revolution was never political. It was spiritual. And that is why, long after the applause fades and the monuments crumble, one truth remains. The man who walked out of prison taught the world how to be free.